Dear Jeff Metcalf, your son is dead because you failed to teach him that black boys have boundaries. By Dr. Stacey Patton. You can listen to the audio version below. Yesterday evening, Jeff Metcalf, the father of Austin Metcalf, used his victim impact statement to address Carmelo Anthony directly, after he was sentenced to 35 years after the court treated his act of survival as murder. The elder Metcalf reportedly described Austin as a boy, twin, son, leader, true warrior. He remembered him as a baby grabbing his finger. He talked about teaching him to fish, watching him take his first buck, and seeing him grow up too fast. He spoke of a scholarship created in Austin's memory and said his family had been robbed. He insisted this case was never about race. He said, "We all bleed the same color." And he described his grief not as sadness, but as rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. And then he turned that rage on the black 19-year-old sitting before him. You failed your parents, you failed yourself, and you failed society. You don't belong in this community. He also reportedly told him, "You're going to prison," and, "You can't even look me in the eyes right now, but you can stab my fucking son in the heart." And right there, in his own words, Jeff Metcalf told on himself. He thought he was only giving us a portrait of a lost, beloved son. A baby gripping his father's finger. A boy learning to fish. A boy taking his first buck. A son, a twin, a leader, a true warrior. But he was also telling us what was taught inside his home and about the cultural socialization that helped his son meet his fate under that track meet tent in April 2025. So let's talk about Jeff Metcalf's failure as a father. Because when Trayvon Martin was killed, this country put a dead black child on trial. They picked through his school records, his hoodie, his social media pics, his text messages, his teenage moods, his parents, his family structure, and every ordinary adolescent detail they could twist into evidence that he had somehow authored his own death. When Mike Brown Jr. was killed, they turned his body into a referendum on his character. They called him a thug. They circulated video. They scrutinized his size, his behavior, his family and neighborhood, his choices and gestures, and his very posture in the world, as if any of it justified leaving his body baking in the street for hours in front of his people. When Tamir Rice was killed, they even found a way to interrogate a 12-year-old. They scrutinized his toy gun, his parents' home life, school history, neighborhood, and the judge blamed him for his death by saying he should have known better because he was big for his age. A child was gunned down by police in a park within seconds, and America still asked what his family had done wrong. So now, Jeff Metcalf, let us return this ugly ritual in kind. Since this country loves to examine black parents when black children die, let us examine you. Since America loves to ask what black mothers and fathers failed to teach, let us ask what you failed to teach your son. Since dead black boys are never allowed to remain innocent, let us stop pretending dead white boys are beyond scrutiny. Let us refuse the sentimental immunity given to dead white boys and grieving white fathers. Let's go post-mortem up in here. You stood in that courtroom and told a black teenager he failed his parents, himself, and society. But perhaps the harder truth is that you failed your son first. In your own memorial language, you told us about the kind of white boyhood Austin was raised inside. It was a boyhood steeped in conquest language, hunting rituals, warrior fantasies, masculine toughness, and the romance of force. You told us about a child praised not just for being kind, curious, gentle, or careful, but for becoming a leader and a warrior in a racist culture where those words too often mean dominance. You, sir, told us that Austin learned early how to hold a weapon, how to aim, how to take down a living thing, how to be proud of the kill, how to have that moment folded into the mythology of father and son. This tells us something about the values and emotional curriculum being cultivated around him and about what kind of white masculinity was being celebrated. Because white boys are not born believing they have jurisdiction over other people's bodies. They are taught. They are trained by fathers, coaches, peers, churches, schools, gun culture, sports culture, hunting culture, and a nation that keeps confusing aggression with leadership and entitlement with confidence. So when you stood in that courtroom and said Carmelo Anthony failed his parents, himself, and society, you skipped right over the part where you had just described the social world that shaped your own son. You taught Austin what it meant to be a warrior. You taught him that toughness was honorable. You taught him that taking up space was normal. You taught him that confrontation was courage. You socialized Austin into entitlement long before he ever reached that track meet. You failed to teach your boy that black children have boundaries. You failed to teach humility, restraint, or the sacred fact that another person's body is not your jurisdiction. You failed to teach him that another child's space is not a challenge to be conquered. You failed to teach him that community does not mean white boys get to decide who belongs and who does not. You obviously failed to teach your son that touching, confronting, crowding, testing, or policing another person can have consequences. And you failed to teach him that the same world that cheers white boys for being bold and aggressive will not always be there to save them when they mistake somebody else's restraint for permission. You failed, Jeff. And I will not let you leave these truths out of the story. It is easier to stand in a courtroom and call Carmelo Anthony a failure than it is to admit that Austin's death did not begin with the knife. It began with every lesson that told your son that he had the right to approach, challenge, and cross a boundary. It began with every adult who smiled at white boy entitlement and called it leadership. It began with every cultural script that taught him black boys are the ones to be feared, but never taught him that black boys might also be afraid. Because grief and rage are real, Jeff. Losing a child is an unimaginable rupture no parent should ever have to survive. But there is something deeply revealing about an adult white man standing in a courtroom, pointing all of that grief and rage at a black teen, and telling him he failed society and does not belong in the community. No, sir. You don't get to stand up there in a courtroom and talk that kind of shit to one of our own. You don't get to use the language of grief dressed up in the language of racial banishment. You do not get to say this was never about race, and then reach for one of the oldest racial scripts in the American archive. You don't belong here. WTF. You didn't just say, my son is dead and I am broken. You said, you do not belong among us. Among whom, exactly? Whether you intended it or not, whether you want to admit it or not, you don't belong in this community carries history. It carries sundown towns, schoolhouse doors, and white mobs outside courthouses. It carries the old civic theology of white space, where black folks are tolerated only so long as they are quiet, grateful, submissive, and available for punishment. And I'm not about to sit quietly while a black teenager is verbally exiled from a community that had already decided what he was before the facts could even breathe. You don't belong in this community is not just a father's grief spilling over. It is a declaration of removal. And it is the language of somebody who believes he has the authority to decide who gets to stay, who must disappear, and whose presence contaminates the social order. Like father, like son. Your words landed on top of centuries of black children being told they do not belong in white schools, neighborhoods, playgrounds, pools, churches, white juries, white imaginations, and white definitions of innocence. They landed on top of every black boy this country has turned into a threat before he ever had a chance to be a child. You are free to make choices, you told Carmelo, but you are not free from those consequences. I agree. But that principle cannot begin and end with Carmelo Anthony. If we are going to talk about choices and consequences, then we have to talk about all of them. We have to talk about Austin's choice to approach and confront, his choice to touch, his choice to believe that another person's space was his to control, his choice to ignore a warning, his choice to participate in a long cultural tradition of policing black bodies and space. I know, Jeff, that you cannot fix your mouth to admit that big white boys like your sons make others afraid. That black children have good reason to be on guard around white bodies. I know that you cannot imagine that a black boy might look at a white boy pressing into his space and understand, at a cellular level, that danger does not always announce itself with a hood, a badge, or a gun. Sometimes danger shows up as entitlement. Sometimes danger shows up as move, and you don't belong here. And when black folk name that, we are told not to politicize it. We are told to be respectful. We are told to honor grief. We are told to stop making everything about race. But this country made everything about race. So let's stop pretending the architecture is invisible. Jeff, I watched how you were allowed to slam your hands, shout about your rage, curse, condemn, and banish. And you said nothing about forgiveness. Folks will say, well, he's grieving. But let a black parent rage like that in a courtroom. Let a black mother or father slam their hands on a table and say the community failed their child. Let a black father point at a white defendant and say, you do not belong here. The same people sanctifying white rage would suddenly discover decorum. And let me be very clear, Jeff, defending Carmelo Anthony's humanity is not the same as celebrating Austin Metcalf's death. That is another cheap trick people love to play. The minute black folks refuse to join the public stoning of a black youth, somebody will accuse us of lacking compassion for the dead. But I know how to hold more than one truth at a time. Austin is dead. Your family is devastated. That matters. Carmelo Anthony is alive, but caged inside a racial imagination that had already convicted him. And that matters too. 2 families are shattered. And a whole country is using the tragedy to rehearse the same old script about black guilt and white innocence. So no, Jeff, Carmelo Anthony did not fail society by existing in a society that has never known how to see black boys whole. He did not fail his parents because he survived a confrontation that spiraled into catastrophe. He did not forfeit his humanity because your grief demands somewhere to go. And he does belong in this community. He belongs in the community of those of us who know that this isn't about race, is often the first lie people tell when race is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Oh, and let me address this line of yours. You can't even look me in the eye right now, but you can stab my fucking son in the heart. Quite frankly, I am glad Carmelo did not give you the courtesy of looking you in the eye. Because even there, even in that courtroom, even with a black boy sitting before the machinery of the state, you still wanted control. You still wanted access to his body and deference. You still wanted his face, his gaze, his submission, his performance of shame. You wanted him to lift his eyes and meet yours so you could decide what you saw there. Remorse, defiance, fear, guilt, whatever story your grief needed to tell. But Carmelo owed you none of that. Not his eyes, not his body, not his obedience, not his emotional performance, not one more piece of himself. There was power in him not looking at you. There was refusal in it. There was survival in it. There was an ancient knowing in it. Because black people know what it means when a white man demands eye contact from a black child after already deciding what that child is. We know the old ritual. We know that sometimes "look at me" is not a request for humanity. It is a demand for surrender. And Carmelo did not surrender. He sat there and withheld the one thing you still thought you were entitled to command. Maybe that is what enraged you most. Not just that Austin is dead. Not just that Carmelo is alive. But that this black boy would not complete the scene for you. He would not bow his head the way you wanted. He would not offer his face as a screen for your rage. He would not let you turn his eyes into another courtroom exhibit. And maybe at an ancestral level, he already knew. Besides, he had already seen enough under that tent. Now go grieve, Jeff. Mourn your son. Try to heal. Sit with the unbearable truth of what has been lost. Let the rage burn down into something more honest than exiling a black teenager your son bullied. But do not confuse your grief with moral clarity. You have your dead to mourn. We have our living children to defend. This Substack is reader-supported. To receive new posts and support my work, consider becoming a free or paid subscriber.